I think you may already have been told that it's likely there's going to be a vote almost any minute now, and I have warned Mr. Gates that when people start leaving, it's not because of him, it's because there is actually going to be a vote. My lords, members of the House of Commons, distinguished guests, welcome to the Queen's robing room, and thank you so much for coming. Bill Gates began his major philanthropic work 20 years ago when he set up the William H. Gates Foundation, focusing on global health. In 2000, this foundation and another venture, the Gates Library Foundation, were merged to form the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the guiding principle of which is to expand opportunities for the world's poorest people by means of working with partners and with the recipients of the foundation's grants. I guess there is no one here who doesn't automatically connect the name of Bill Gates with Microsoft, the company he created while still a student in the 1970s. And today, I might add, is to the day the 31st anniversary of the launch of the first series of Windows in 1983. In 2008, Bill became the chairman of the company, and this has allowed him more time to focus on the work of the foundation and, with Melinda, a more hands-on approach to the issues they champion. This evening, Bill will be talking about the case for aid in this, the inaugural lecture of the Lord Speaker series. He'll speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, after which we hope to have a conversation in the guise of a question and answer session. I'm delighted, therefore, to introduce you to Mr. Bill Gates.
Well, thank you, Lord Speaker, for that generous introduction, and thank you for making me the inaugural speaker for your lecture series. Also, great thanks for your active work over the years on behalf of global health and development, including your research on the causes of famine and your service to the United Nations. It's an honor to be with you here in the robing room, which I understand conveys the values and the history of this great country. What I want to focus on today is the great opportunity to make the world a better place, the progress we're making, and some of the opportunities to accelerate that. These are causes that my country, the United States, and the United Kingdom are in fact engaged on in a very exciting way. In fact, in many ways, leading the efforts to improve lives all over the world. I believe that not only rich countries, but also wealthy people and wealthy organizations really have an obligation to think about those most in need, to take the great resources we have, the great technology we have, and make sure that it's made available to those who need it most. I'll touch on 3 topics, and then I'll leave time for whatever discussion or questions people have. I'll start with the Ebola epidemic, because that's topical and really illustrates important work that the UK and our foundation do together. I'll talk about malaria, again, a scourge that has really affected many countries, and yet we have a chance to reduce that burden substantially in the years ahead. And finally, I'll talk about vaccines, which have been a miracle tool, and even more can be done there. Well, this Ebola epidemic is a very scary thing. It's taken thousands of lives directly, and indirectly by shutting down the health systems in these countries, it's killed even more. More women dying in childbirth, or people dying in malaria. The health systems for all 22 million of the people in the 3 affected countries really are not operating. And it's been impressive to see the kind of response we've had. The people of Great Britain have been particularly leaders in this, coming up with over £205 million, which makes this country the second largest supporter, the largest in Europe, but second only to what the United States has done. The quick response Getting out in the forefront, taking responsibility for Sierra Leone, which is a particularly tough country to do this work, getting all the equipment out there. But it's not just the large-scale government commitments that are worth talking about. It's the 800 NHS staff who volunteered to go out there and put themselves at risk. It's people like William Pooley, who've recovered and are going right back out to help out. Or Ruth Atkins, the first volunteer to receive the experimental Ebola vaccine, which will be a very important tool for this outbreak and for future outbreaks. And, of course, the British public that's shown itself to be generous for so many causes with things like comic relief. And again here, donating over £4 million just in the first few days of this Ebola appeal. So the leadership being shown here in the response and being a big funder of medical research so that we'll in the future be able to come out with tools even faster mean that we have a very significant chance to halt this epidemic. We have a chance to go back into those countries and build effective primary health care systems so that future outbreaks would be detected sooner and stopped at a very early stage. I hope this Ebola epidemic will make it clear to us that we need to do more to be ready for other epidemics. It's very likely in the next 20 years something will come along that's even more transmissive than Ebola. Fortunately, this is not a disease that you can transmit just by coughing like the flu or measles. But as we see how long it's taken to make certain decisions and pull things together, we can realize that if it had been more transmissive, we might not have stopped it until the numbers got very, very large. So whether it's surveillance, data systems, quick manufacturing capabilities, there's many things that are indicated here that it's important we not forget even as we get on top of the numbers here. We can see here that we all should care about global health. What happened in Africa is a tragedy, but in this interconnected world, if we don't solve these problems, they will spread to many, many countries, particularly to the poorer countries, but all countries are at risk. To move on now, let me talk about malaria. Malaria, of course, has been around as long as mankind has. And it's another disease that bears disproportionately on the world's poorest. Historically, of course, malaria existed in temperate zones. In fact, of course, it was named in Italy for bad air because the swamps were actually where it was. They didn't know that. They thought maybe it was the smell or something like that. In fact, it was Ronald Ross, a British officer, hanging out down in India, who took to dissecting mosquitoes and actually won an early Nobel Prize for proving that the malaria vector was, in fact, the mosquito. Malaria kills over 600,000 every year, and over 2/3 of those deaths are children in Africa. But the burden is even greater than that number would suggest. There's over 200 million cases a year. For every child who dies, there's at least 3 kids who've had a form of cerebral malaria that reduces their mental capacity for the rest of their life. Malaria is very tough on pregnant women. In fact, a significant percentage of low birth weight deliveries are because of the high infection rate that exists for malaria in these African countries. And so really, if we want to improve health substantially, we've got to solve malaria. We've got to reduce the malaria map country by country and have within a generation a goal of total eradication. Well, here with malaria, it's another great example where I'd say the 3 leading entities on this are the United States, our foundation, and the UK. The UK, of course, with great generosity coming from DFID. There's a commitment to get out 33 million bed nets, commitment to provide malaria prevention to 11 million pregnant women, and DFID's been a huge supporter of the group called Medicines for Malaria Venture, started back in 1999, which is advancing some very exciting malaria drugs, including some drugs that you just take the pill once, and you have a complete cure for not only the patient, but also the clearing of your blood so that if another mosquito bites you, you don't become the source of the parasite that is passed along to someone else. Today's drugs, even though they get you to be healthy, they don't eliminate the gameticidal stage from your blood, and so there's still transmission taking place. Our foundation funds a lot of malaria work, and two of the places that are substantially the best in the world that we partner with are the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. In fact, Liverpool's where the most innovative work on vector controls is getting done, coming up with new insecticides that have no side effects, making sure that as we're deploying bed nets, we take the current insecticide, pyrethroids, which we're seeing resistance to, and make sure we substitute with something that's significantly potent. So we're really at a turning point here. We brought malaria deaths down from 1 million to a 500,000 a year. But if we don't really double down, if we don't really energize our efforts, the parasite evolves. And so our current drugs, which are these artemisinin type drugs or our bed net insecticides, the vector evolves around it. And so the idea that eventually, the way to make sure that this is all sustainable is to do eradications, I think makes a lot of sense. What we'll have to do for the next several decades is work in parallel, bring the case counts down with things like bed nets and vector control, and pick parts of the map and learn how to do local eliminations. For example, the malaria community is coming together to do an elimination in Southeast Asia. That's where we're seeing the emergence of malaria parasites that are resistant to our latest drug, the artemisinin. And so DFID, the United States, our foundation, and others are saying, okay, let's take the malaria burden in those countries, which actually is not gigantic, and should make it possible to go out and treat all those cases and actually wipe those countries off the malaria map and make sure, therefore, that that resistant form of the parasite doesn't travel west. Twice before, in the 1970s for chloroquine and the 1980s for SP, the resistance started in Southeast Asia and spread all the way to Africa, and so the death rates rose quite substantially. Earlier this month, at a meeting of tropical medical researchers, I reiterated our foundation's commitment in this area, including the commitment to be involved in the eradication. We're increasing our malaria budget over 30% because of this commitment, and the British government, along with the U.S., have been the biggest partners that have really made long-term commitments that will help us win this battle. Now, finally, let me finish by talking a little bit about vaccines. Vaccines are really a miracle tool. In fact, the one disease that there's been a global eradication of, smallpox, was because there was an effective vaccine and it got out and it was given to everyone. So smallpox hasn't been seen since 1979. We're using a vaccine, a polio vaccine. We're very close to making polio the second disease to be eradicated. We have less than 200 cases this year, and in fact, in the last few months, we haven't had cases in Africa, and so with luck, all we have to do is get rid of the disease in the two countries we've had recent cases, which are Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then we start a 3-year period that they make absolutely sure it's not around before we get that disease eradication certification. Now, my love of vaccines goes back to the early commitment to form the foundation. My wife and I were reading about diseases, and we saw one called rotavirus that causes diarrhea that, to our surprise, was killing over 500,000 children a year. And it was amazing to us that that disease, rotavirus, that poor children were not getting a vaccine. In fact, a vaccine was being used in rich countries, but it wasn't getting out to them. And we decided, hey, that was a great example to where philanthropy was necessary to make sure that resources were made available to those most in need. One of the big investments we made to make sure new vaccines would get out to small children was an alliance called the Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and it's a public-private partnership that's done a great job of making sure the very latest vaccines are made available to the poor. Historically, it's been over 20 years between vaccines would be used in the rich world, where actually the risk of disease is far, far less, and then it would trickle down over a long period of time and get out to where the risk was highest. With Gavi, the idea is to, in less than 5 years, make sure the kids at risk get these vaccines, and so some like pentavalent, the rotavirus vaccine, and the pneumococcus vaccine, we're moving to have full coverage. In fact, by 2020, we should have full coverage of all the world's children with those vaccines. By getting these new vaccines out, we've already saved over 6 million lives, and this is a partnership that the UK and our foundation are the biggest funders of. We're working now on the pledging conference that starts next year. We're drawing in other partners. We expect to raise even more money for this because actually, if you look at all the investments in development, buying these vaccines is one of the most impactful things that can be done. It really is fantastic, not only in reducing deaths, but helping the kids to survive, be far healthier. And when parents have healthy kids, we've seen that they choose not to have as many children, which means that the population growth in the poor areas will actually come down to a level that challenges like feeding everyone, educating everyone will become far more tractable. So it's a very exciting time for this idea of new vaccines getting out to all the children of the world. Finally, I'll note that next year is an interesting milestone in that the Millennium Development Goals that the world adopted in 2015 was the deadline to look and see how we've done. In fact, poverty, which was the first goal, has been cut in half. Childhood death, likewise, has been cut from over 12 million to just over 6 million, so again, cut in half. And so in 2015, the world will adopt new goals to cover the period 2015 to 2030. And my view is we can be very ambitious on all of these things. We can accelerate how we improve health, cut those deaths in the next 15 years in half again. And it actually took, that cutting in half last time took 25 years, so that would be a significant acceleration. We need research, we need development aid generosity in order to achieve these goals. But I think the impact of what's gone on here really is quite irrefutable. When we look at the goal of aid, it's really about treating lives equally. It's about helping countries get to a level of self-sufficiency. And historically, many countries that were aid recipients, South Korea, Botswana, Morocco, Brazil, Malaysia, many of what we now call middle-income countries that are not aid recipients are completely self-sufficient. I think over time, we can get all countries there. In fact, all but very few, we should be able to get there between now and 2030. So I want to thank all of you for your support for research and aid generosity. The UK really is an exemplar in terms of the generosity it's provided, and I want to challenge all of us to think about how we can do even more and accelerate the progress we've made and achieve the equity that I'm sure we all believe in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you so much. I think it's incredibly important that we're all reminded quite regularly that aid actually works and that the results are irrefutable. What we're going to do now is to have questions. I know it's always quite difficult for someone to start it off. So for that reason, what we're going to do is to be very modern and very up to date and take a Twitter feed and take a question from Twitter. And I think the last session will also be a Twitter question. But in the meantime, if you could gather, I was going to say gather your wits, but I'm sure they're already gathered. But think about the sort of questions that you might wish to ask, because what I want to do is to, the roving microphones around, is to sort of, go 1, 2, 3, so that the cameras know the next person who's going to be asking a question. Sorry, that sounds a little complicated. Let me give you the first question, if I may. Mr. Gates, how will you measure the point at which the target of malaria elimination has been achieved?
Well, malaria is in a lot of countries today. And the toughest ones by far are the ones on the equator. That's where malaria tends to be all year round. And there's a scientific term, the effective inoculation rate, EIR, which is basically how many times you get bit per year. And in the places where malaria, to the north and south, where it doesn't have a huge hold, you're typically bitten 4 or 5 times a year. In the toughest areas, you're bitten over 100 times a year by a mosquito that's got malaria. So Nigeria may be the last place we've got the disease. The way we'll measure it simply is literally no cases, and we have very good diagnostics. Fortunately, it presents with fairly unique symptoms, and the diagnostics are quite good. And the way the rules work, you have to literally go 3 years with no cases at all before you get your certification. So this is more of a long-term goal. It's not a short-term thing, but ideally we'll get the case count down every year, and we're taking and squeezing the map, particularly from the north and the south, is the goal for the next 5 years.
We have an absolute shower of hands, which is wonderful. I'm going to ask Lord Patel, and then Baroness Hayman, and then Lady Flather, and then I'm going to go to the other side of the room after that. So, Lord Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Gates, for your talk, and for all you have done and continue to do for improving health of the underdeveloped countries and underprivileged people. I am what you might call in your country an OBGYN. And I do work in parts of Africa for different reasons. But my question today to you is what you referred to Ebola epidemic. It's clear that what the failure is here is a systems failure. And you have often spoken about that. And I see today in Financial Times, the previous Secretary of Finance in USA, Larry Summers, talking about establishing a global fund to support development of health systems. What would be your comment to that?
Well, the basic health system, which is often called primary health care, is the key thing. If you want to improve health in a country, it's really that primary health care. So although for all of us, when we think healthcare, we think about doctors with specialty training or a hospital with an operating room, the key thing, the first thing, is to have these primary health care centers where you can get your vaccinations, you can get your prenatal care. Usually the first level isn't good enough to do deliveries in, but you want to get women to the next level up, the secondary level, so they can do safe delivery. And more countries are trying to move deliveries out of the household in to that secondary level, where that's where we have a chance if there's bleeding or some other complication. You've got training, you've got sanitary conditions, you can do the interventions there that make a big difference. We are funders of primary healthcare systems. There's no particular group that has total responsibility for that. World Bank has been the biggest funder. There's a move afoot to get some additional funds for that. One thing that's very interesting is there are some countries who spend plenty of money that they could have good primary healthcare systems, but because they don't train or manage the people or keep the supply chain of the drugs and vaccines well handled, it's not a working system. Nigeria is an example where actually other countries that spend even a little less than they do, like Ghana or Ethiopia, do a very good job. So financial resources are a part of it, but I'd say the even greater component when we look at the variation in who does it well and who doesn't do it well is basic management, where you measure and you make sure the system is working well. And so technical support to build those systems, as well as budgetary support, are key to getting this. And if we'd had this in these three countries, we would have stopped the epidemic sooner. So there would have been huge benefits on an ongoing basis, but also for this crisis as well.
Lady Flather, and then Baroness Hayman, and then, I'm sorry, the light is so bad I can't see. Steve O'Brien after that. And can I ask you that if you're not, if you're from outside Parliament, if you could say who you are and what your organisation is. Lady Flather. No, it's not on. Can someone? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not very
Good.
technically
We got you.
proficient. You can hear me now. Anyway, first of all, I'd like to say how inspiring you are. You and Melinda are inspiring people, and I hope that other people do take your example and do something. I know you went to India and failed miserably, but I'm an Indian, so I can say that. What I wanted to say is that research suggests that the increase in population in both India and Africa has been quite a reason for increase in diseases, because people are living much closer, and there is more chance of them getting ill by being so close together. But that is okay, and you are doing wonderful things. But the most important thing, I think, still is family planning, is try to reduce the number of people who are coming on all the time. Because you say that at some stage, you will be able to control this and that. But by then, if you look at the increase taking place, you'll have a lot more children, you'll have a lot more people who will be needing your help. So unless we actually take family planning along at the same rate as the work you're doing for the diseases. I know Melinda was here for the family planning conference, but all those promises have not been met, which were made at that conference. So please, please, and also you will agree that the women are the worst off people, and this is very important for them.
Great. Yeah, the growth in population is interesting. If we look at the world as a whole, there are lots of places where the population is shrinking, and then the very poorest parts of the world are where you have large population growth. So even if you take India, in the south, there's like Kerala is below replacement rate, whereas up in the north, you have very high population growth. There are many ways, one, to help with that. One is to improve access to contraceptives for women who want that. Another is as you educate women, or actually as you improve health of children, families choose to have less children as you improve health. So we have countries with high population growth and bad health, and countries with good health and low population growth. We have everyone fits into those two categories. So all of these health investments, as well as contraceptive availability, will reduce the peak population. Amazingly today, there's enough places shrinking that the number of kids who are 0 to 5 has peaked. That is, the birth cohort of the world reached its maximum in the past at about 138 million. Now it's down to 134 million. So all of the population growth we're seeing as we go to about 9.4 billion from 7.1 is actually filling in the age pyramid, but we should pay attention to population growth because it's happening where it'll be the most difficult to handle, and we need to do more about that.
It's Baroness Hayman, and then it's going to be Stephen O'Brien. I think it's Paul there, Farley, and then Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you very much, and can I echo the gratitude and the admiration for everything that you've achieved. My question's about vaccine discovery rather than vaccine delivery. Gavi's been a fantastic success, but the market has failed us as far as vaccines for diseases of the poor are concerned. It's not, I suspect, that Ebola or schistosomiasis or hookworm or Chagas are uniquely difficult vaccines to discover. The funding mechanism for making them attractive to the pharma industry as we understand it is at root of the problem in this. And I'd be fascinated to know your thoughts on some work, obviously in malaria particularly, has been done already. What more could be done to speed up the discovery of new vaccines?
Yeah, it's actually a good thing that rotavirus, this diarrheal disease, is all over the world. So, the basic research to create it and the recovery of the large expenses of the big trials and everything, it was the rich countries and the middle-income countries that funded that. So for a few of these vaccines, like the pneumococcus vaccine, that's been very profitable, and then the poorest countries get it at a very good price. The place you've got a big problem is where the disease is not present in rich countries, or it's at such a low level that they don't discern a market. And that's where the only solution is to have governments or philanthropists step in. And so for a lot of things, like different types of diarrhea, like ETEC, Shigella, cholera, typhoid, it's been very important for government entities to go after the funding. In this area as well, the big three funders are the United States National Institute of Health, our foundation, and actually the UK is the third biggest on this. We should be doing more. If we had our dream, a malaria vaccine that's totally effective, might be top of the list. We have a first-generation vaccine that GSK, with significant funding from us, has come out with. It's valuable, but we need a second-generation vaccine to have full effectiveness. Second, we might ask for a HIV vaccine. Third, we might ask for a tuberculosis vaccine. And there are probably another dozen or so, all of which are being worked on, but we could be doing even more. So that upstream R&D, the market just isn't going to provide it, and that's kind of a market failure because the benefit of having those things is very, very high. Fortunately, it's only about 15 of them, and I think in the next decade we'll get more than half of those will be discovered because we fund the pharma companies and therefore sort of create the market that otherwise wouldn't exist.
Thank you. And Stephen O'Brien, Member of Parliament and campaigning on malaria for 30 years, but above all in the room in Seattle when you and Melinda announced your ambition to eradicate malaria in your lifetimes. A magnificent galvanizing moment for all of us. We now have the proven success that what has been working in malaria is bringing down the deaths from 1 million to about 650,000, which is very good for arguing the political case for more public funds to match your philanthropic funds and the President's Malaria Initiative, which has been so significant. As we now look at the potential for resurgency, how important is it, do you think, for us to be able to name the amount, as we did in the current Parliament, about up to £500 million to be spent on malaria control, and secondly, to maintain the amount of resource, because resurgency is as much a risk as actually getting the deaths down? Yeah,
at this tropical medical conference I was at, we had a dinner of people who focus on malaria, including Chris Whitty from DFID and Admiral Zimmer, who's the head of the U.S. President's Malaria Initiative. And, it's very interesting that if you look at the possibilities for malaria, if we don't stay vigilant, a negative scenario where the deaths go back up is not impossible. We've got to renew the drugs, we've got to renew the bed nets, and the UK commitment, which was, I believe, £500 million a year, really made a huge difference. When you think about researchers, they want to know that if they invent something, it will be taken through trials and that there'll be uptake for it to be bought. And so a lot of global health innovation is sitting in the lab, but people think, oh, there wouldn't be any funding for that. And so with malaria, people saw that, the world was really stepping up in a big way. Basically, my view would be that that level of funding ideally would be maintained until we get disease eradication. And we're careful not to suggest to people that's an overnight thing. Within 20 to 25 years, it's absolutely doable, and there'll be some amazing milestones along the way in terms of getting deaths down, avoiding drug resistance, which is the big bugaboo that has actually been the reason why, if you look at that death chart, there are two huge upswings as we let drug resistance sweep the world, first with chloroquine and then with SP. So that UK commitment really has been vital. The US and the UK and the Global Fund, which of course the US and UK are big givers to, but others as well. Those are the three biggest funders of getting interventions out into the poor countries.
Paul, and then let me see who else on this side. And sorry, I'm so sorry I can't see, but yes. Here, Simon, sorry.
Thanks, Francis. I'm Bill. I'm a member of the all-party malaria group, which is chaired by Jeremy Lefroy in the Commons, Jeremy's done so much good work in highlighting this issue here. It's 10 years since I was in Malawi looking at DFID's work on HIV, malaria, where your foundation was already present there, and tuberculosis, and you've just touched on this. I just wanted to ask you, to what extent are you and the foundation exercised by the failure to find new drugs to combat antibiotic resistance, not just with TB, but across the board? And what lessons your work on vaccines with public and private partnerships might be offered to that quest?
Yeah, it's interesting. The TB is a very special bacteria. It's particularly hard. The drugs, the cell wall of the bacteria is particularly hard to get to, and the way it hides in the lung inside these granulomas. So coming up, in general, the world's not coming up with enough antibiotics. And so even in rich countries, sometimes because you go to a hospital and get a hospital-acquired infection, you can end up with a bacterial infection that either very few antibiotics work or in extreme cases where it's completely resistant. The dilemma here is that the economic reward for coming up with those antibiotics hasn't been very strong, and so a special incentive system is probably needed there. The good news is the science now of understanding what do antibiotics look like and are there shortcuts to the discovery of antibiotics. There are a few companies that have some very good leads where they look at bacterial genomes and actually see things that are like antibiotics and find things that they hadn't seen before. So at the very front end of the pipeline, I'd say there's more today than there's been for the last 20 years. So if we create the right incentive system, the science is there to solve this. And it's a big problem in the US. I know there's some leaders here in the UK have highlighted this and are trying to get the medical community behind it. We're part of that, partly because the general approaches used there will be helpful for TB. There's a better TB drug pipeline today than at any time in the last 50 years. The world had invented a few drugs that worked pretty well, and then some drug-resistant TB came along. About 15% of all TB in the world has some level of drug resistance. It's particularly bad in South Africa. The worst thing is to take a partial course of drugs and then you basically breed your disease to be disease resistant, and that can be passed along. So I think the world will respond effectively both on antibiotics in general and TB, but it's another one where the government's role, the market alone, without a little bit of incentive, won't solve that.
Andrew Mitchell.
It's very good to see you in London again, and I say that advisedly because, of course, you are so much more effective at getting across this message than any politician of any party is. and you carry much more conviction, reaching even the readers of the Daily Mail. So, I mean, I think that it's really important that you come here as often as possible, and I'm glad that on this occasion you were only interrupted by one vote, whereas when you came and spoke to the House of Commons and the Conservative Party, I think you were interrupted by 3. So I think we've got off quite lightly tonight. The second thing I wanted to say was that I'm so glad you mentioned vaccinations, because this is an area which immediately resonates with the public. They understand it absolutely. And as a result of the initiative of the government and you and Melinda, crowding in a lot of public, private and country money into the new vaccination effort, it means that in Britain we are paying, over the course of this 5-year parliament, sufficient for a child to be vaccinated every 2 seconds and a life of a child in the poor world to be saved every 2 minutes from diseases which, of course, none of our children die from. So I just think that it's an incredibly important message in Britain as well, and I hope we're going to come back here an awful lot and spread this message, at this time particularly, because we have the power to make a huge difference, and you're leading that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew and I first met when he was the shadow secretary for DFID, and I gained admiration for the shadow system because he had already thought about what he was going to do when he got a chance to be the secretary of DFID, and actually very quickly we did the Gavi first big conference, and then actually with my wife Melinda, the reproductive health with very ambitious goals, so-called Family Planning 2020 was put together, and so we're working hard to fulfill those promises that were great. And the vaccination message, you know, I'm very optimistic the UK will stay in a very strong position. I'll be in Berlin tomorrow spreading the gospel of vaccines, and we're hoping that we think they're going to step up in a big way as well. So actually, even in tough budget times, that priority seems to be shining through.
Before Simon speaks, can I see if there's anyone from an external organization? Yes. Yes, after Simon, perhaps you would. Simon.
I join my thanks to you both for what you've done. I'm an MP in London with a large staff and community, but I also lost an older brother through malaria some time ago, which obviously has influenced our family's views. As well as education and vaccination and prevention, how much do you think intervention by speedy diagnosis and treatment has to play, which seems to be the fundamental role of primary healthcare provision throughout Africa and elsewhere?
Yeah, primary health care is an amazing thing. Even in Africa, a high percentage of women come in before they give birth, and there's a lot of interventions there that really affect the baby. More and more, as we build up the capacity of those systems, they come in and actually do the deliveries. That's a challenge. They come in to get the vaccines. As you say, when the vaccine alone's not enough, that's where they show up to get treatment. So that's where the antibiotics for the diseases we don't have vaccines for, or the antimalarials, because we don't yet have a vaccine for that, that's where that treatment takes place. And the foundation initially didn't focus that much on how we would play a role strengthening those primary health care centers. And now we've realized that along with our disease-specific work, we need to be more involved in that, because the variance between the good ones and the bad ones in poor countries is quite amazing. And if we could get you know, all the countries to be like the good ones, say Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana, that alone would save 1.5 million children a year. So it's the foundational system, and the more people can go out and see that primary healthcare worker and the heroic work they do, the clearer it'll be that should be part of our commitment.
So we have the lady at the back there, and then Andrew Stone, and then Lord Tree.
Hello, I'm Tulip Mazumdar from BBC News. I'm Global Health Correspondent. I've recently come back from Sierra Leone, where we were reporting on the Ebola outbreak, and I'm hopefully off to Guinea in the next few weeks. So I've seen firsthand some of the suffering there. I saw a 4-month-old be buried within a few hours of arriving into Guinea, and then I saw a man who'd come for treatment just outside Freetown, who'd followed all the advice, come for treatment, and was turned away because there wasn't enough beds to treat him, and he died within 12 hours. I've also seen the brave work of the health workers, including some of the British who are out there, and I went to the Kerry Town facility to look at some of that really important work. But just talking about vaccines and treatments, and trying to find some sort of, glimmer of hope in this quite dark situation. Some vaccines and some treatments have been fast-tracked, which is good news. WHO is obviously looking with governments and with GSK and other Institute of National Health in the US to fast-track some of these treatments and vaccines. Do you think that that is something that can happen within the next 6 to 12 months? Could we find a cure for Ebola now that there is the momentum behind this, since, frankly, it came to the West?
Yeah, so I don't want to go into too much depth on this, but interestingly, partly because Ebola was funded with some anti-bioterrorism money, we have a number of constructs that are partially ready. So like the GSK vaccine, a lot of work had been done. The VSV vaccine, where it was Canadian funded and an Iowa company, it's partly done. It hasn't been through a phase 3. Its efficacy hasn't been proven. And I think good work is being done to get those vaccines out very quickly. I'd say that the thing that still should be done is more in the therapeutic area, because it does appear in lab tests that a number of antiviral drugs that have been approved for other uses, some fully phase 3 tested and available, some earlier stage, it does appear that at least at the experimental level, they have activity against Ebola. So getting some of these therapeutics out there would be very important. Our foundation's involved in taking the ZMAP construct, which is a triple antibody construct, and moving it over into a production system, so-called CHO cells, so that can get going, and probably in the January timeframe, if things go well, we ought to be able to have significant production of that. The thing right now is some of these therapeutic drugs, which may have activity, like there's one called brincidofovir, but there's several others that have been shown, and the exact process that those are going to get out there and get used, and what should the protocol be for that. That's an opportunity that we probably should move faster on. Overall, once the panic button was pushed in August or September, I'd give the world pretty good marks for responding pretty quickly. It's good news that the case data in Liberia shows a leveling to a decline, and so hopefully some of those resources that were being ramped up, some of those can go and help out in Sierra Leone and Guinea, and so we can start to see those case rates going down. Looking at the case line data, it is, there's still a significant number of the cases out of Guinea and Sierra Leone that appeared to be caused at funerals. The data is very imperfect data, but they asked people, have you been to a funeral recently? And you see this hugely elevated number, and that's very suggestive that one of the things that worked well in Liberia was they changed the funeral-related behavior. So, a lot of heroes out there, a lot of things that are coming together, and a lot of lessons that when the next thing comes along that could be even more transmissive, that the speed with which we organize drugs, vaccines, resources, if it was worse, we would need to do even better than we did this time.
Andrew? Andrew Stone? Yes.
Mr. Gates, you've been very modest and humble and polite, and I'm amazed how you've got so much done without being excited and angry. I know more about schistosomiasis than I do about malaria, and you generously gave $30 million to the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative in Imperial College, and they've treated 100 million people. But you talked about control and then elimination and then eradication. And for eradication, it takes hundreds of millions. However, what I was struck by as a business person is that there are 50 million dailies in Africa. A daily is a disability annual lost year. 50 million people can't work because of this illness. So if they earned $1 a day, this is $18 billion. Now, if you therefore take your generosity and your philanthropy together with government money for all aid and realize that if you eliminated an illness like this, then in that case, the self-sufficiency you talked about would be happening. So what I'm asking about, because I hate silos, is are you frustrated, or are you able to knock these people together to realize that if you put that money to these issues, then in that case there would be self-sufficiency? Thank you.
Yeah, schistosomiasis is a very interesting case. My basic view is I'm an impatient optimist. That is, I see immense progress, and I see an opportunity to go even faster. And you know, the UK increase in its generosity really has set an amazing example. And that new money is, you know, applied to the latest in malaria, or the latest in getting drugs out. Schistosomiasis is among a class of diseases that have the interesting name neglected tropical diseases. So hopefully we won't neglect them and they'll be misnamed. One of the great things that happened a few years ago is that through work with the pharmaceutical companies, there was an open-ended commitment made that the drugs for many of these, 7 of these diseases, including the worms, hookworm, and a number of them, that they are donated. And so these are pills that if you take once or twice a year, you get rid of the disease. Now we're trying to figure out how intense you have to be in terms of age groups and dosing to actually do for this local eliminations. That's not completely known, but there have been some countries that have done eliminations. But because the drugs are free now, all you have to fund is the actual distribution. It's called mass drug administration, where you call out either just school-age children or all ages and get them in to do this. And the thing we're being smarter about is if you have multiple of these diseases in an area, they'll go and get and use that one delivery event to give you all of these drugs. They also often will do vitamin A or other nutritional things. And so the world now has this map and saying, okay, which areas are funded for this mass drug administration, which areas are not. And over the next 3 to 4 years, between governments and philanthropy, I hope we can fill in that map and fill it in with an intensity that a number of these things, you know, where I'd say hookworm and schistosomiasis would be the top 2 on the list that you'd really like to get rid of, because their burden is gigantic. Even though they don't kill that many, they're causing malnutrition, they're causing you not to be able to learn. You know, it's pretty horrific stuff. It was actually present in the United States in the 1920s, but eventually they were eliminated there. So I'm quite optimistic about those group of diseases as well.
Lord Tree, and then you're in camera.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gates, for coming and talking to us. I'm a vet, and I spent most of my career at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine working on animal health as well as human health in the tropics. And I want to add my gratitude to the terrific impact your foundation has had, of course, on tropical human health. But I'd also like to thank you for the attention your foundation is now giving to animal health, which, of course, in many developing countries is very important for the nutritional health of the indigenous people, for their socio-economic development, and, of course, their domestic animals can harbour infections transmissible to them. And I would like to ask you a bit about rabies. You mentioned the possibility of eradicating certain infections, and historically we've done that with smallpox and rinderpest in cattle, and polio is on the agenda. But rabies is undoubtedly a relatively low-hanging fruit in that respect. Now, it doesn't kill as many people. It's not as big a problem as malaria, but many tens of thousands of people, mainly children, die horrible deaths from rabies. We have good vaccines for dogs which can reduce the impact. I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about your foundation's strategy or thoughts about rabies elimination.
Yeah, rabies is, of course, a horrific disease, and you know, most humans get it because a rabid dog, comes and bites often, you know, kids that are playing. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a plan for a true eradication, because there's quite a few mammals, including raccoons. Oh no, that's leprosy, sorry. Including, I think, deer and even bats, I think. Say again? Foxes. There's quite a few animals that are viewed to be a natural reservoir. And so I think, we could bring, we should bring rabies rates way down. If we would just vaccinate the domestic dogs, you'd bring the rates down by about a factor of 10. I think the current view is unless you come up with some very clever thing like animal bait or various things, that it's going to be hard to get rid of the natural reservoir. But I'm not an expert on that one. The beauty of the current situation is that if we can tick a few of these off, then we can intensify on the remaining. And the total number of diseases, it's less. The big ones are less than 20. The total list is less than 50. And so as we get the big ones down, then we ought to be able to intensify and get the things like rabies. But I don't think there's a concrete plan except for case reduction right now.
Penultimate question, Ewan Cameron.
Yes. Thank you very much. I wanted to slightly change the subject too on agriculture, because I know you share my view that in terms of relief of poverty in the developing world, improved agriculture is probably the best tool for development that we have. And one of the more terrifying statistics I heard recently is from CADUP, who said that if the African population grows as we know it's going to grow, and agriculture in Africa develops at its current rate of progress, then sub-Saharan Africa will only be providing 13% of its food by 2050. Now that to me spells anarchy, wars, all sorts of problems. And I was wondering what your latest thinking was on what we could possibly do differently to avert this disaster, or alternatively, looking on the bright side, what are the opportunities we have to really kickstart the whole sub-Saharan African economy and boost what's going on. And if you could finish before 10 o'clock, I'd be grateful. Yeah.
All right. Well, African agriculture productivity is typically less than a quarter of what you'd see in Europe and the United States. And even if you take out irrigation and do the comparison, it's still a factor of 3. Now, they're not using good seeds, their soils are not as good, they're not using fertilizer, and so those are things that are very fixable. Their crops are somewhat neglected, sorghum, cassava, and even the right adaptations of the big crops, rice, wheat, and maize, the appropriate work for the environmental conditions in Africa, and the right infrastructure for things like hybrid seed and training the farmers just haven't been done. So the opportunity for huge productivity increases really is there. If you look at Ethiopia, for example, where we've partnered quite a bit, they have this thing called the Agricultural Transformation Agency that we partnered with them on. They've seen over the last 8 years 7% a year growth in agricultural productivity, and that's really exemplary. If you look at the livestock sector that was mentioned, actually we have Edinburgh as kind of a world capital for livestock health and genetics and things like that. So we have a lot of partners there that are helping us in this. That's an area where by improving the genetics, improving the health, which again is vaccines, but animal vaccines, we ought to be able to see dramatic improvements in African productivity. Now we do have the headwind of climate change, which although in the near term it's not that dramatic, if you go out 20, 30 years, the severe weather, both drought, heavy rains, the places where it intensifies the most is actually in the tropical regions, including parts of Africa. And so we have to be very amazing at making these improvements. One of the great underfunded things is public agriculture research. The so-called centers, the CGIAR centers that do this work, exist on less than $400 million a year. So agriculture research needs to be more of a priority. People that got off the world agenda, then about 2005 it got back on the agenda. Unfortunately then with the financial crisis, the generosity going into that sector didn't go up nearly as much as we needed. Fortunately, plant genetics and human genetics are the same. So some of those incredible tools that are being used on the human side will allow scientific progress on improving plants. If we empower these research groups with new tools and new training, I think we can make good progress. So even with those stark figures that sound about right to me, I think we can drive the trend the other direction. We've got to make Africa a net exporter of food. It's kind of a strange thing. Africa's a huge net importer of food today. You know, Nigeria, that should be a breadbasket, imports rice from Thailand. And, you know, it's just the right things haven't been done in these agricultural systems. So after health, the second biggest area of investment that we have is this agriculture work, and a lot of exciting possibilities there.
Last question, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, we've come nearly to the end. From Twitter. Bill, it says, if you were advising a government on how to spend their 0.7% commitment to overseas development aid, how would you set priorities? And 1 minute.
All right. Well, I'm sure Andrew can testify we're not shy about sharing our opinion. I was over at DFID today sharing my opinion and thanking the Ebola team there that's been working night and day to drive things forward. I think there's a very healthy level of dialogue. In many ways, DFID is our closest partner. USAID is also a very close partner. I'd say increasingly other aid agencies, but DFID has been very strong in stepping up on these global health issues. It's been, you know, if you look at the categories of the DFID aid budget as it's gone up, health has gotten a disproportionate share, and I think that's for very, very good reason. You know, things like malaria, Gavi, new vaccines, those are really necessary, not totally sufficient, but very necessary to uplift these countries and help them be self-sufficient. And it's a thing people can understand. They know that a mother wants her child to survive. They know that, you know, kids really deserve to have nutrition. And so as aid spending has gotten smarter over the years, the health and agricultural categories have grown, and the intelligence of how we measure things. We bring in the private sector, you know, partnering with people like GSK in the right way, where by making volume commitments, they bring the price down. So I'd give DFID, you know, a high grade, and I think we're all learning together. You know, we spend our money a lot better today than we did 10 years ago, and I'm sure 5 years from now, you know, we'll look back on some of our grants and, you know, wonder what we were thinking. So this is a learning field where the analytic and, you know, hard thinking skills that you associate with the private sector are more and more in this field. And, you know, we're proud to be part of the movement that's bringing that type of urgency to a topic that in some ways is even more important than most company product decisions.
That was a marathon session, and we thank you.
Thank you.